Hello, my name is Madison Perron from the Computational Memory Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2022 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. Today I'm going to be presenting a context-based model of recall and decisions, which is joint work with James Perron and Michael Kahana. The motivation for our paper is to bridge a gap between the role of memory in recall and decision-making on one hand, and the ways in which these processes are often modeled on the other. Specifically, in existing models of memory, one assumes that the encoding process, or how information is encoded in memory, is entirely separated from the retrieval and decision processes. Memory is explicitly modeled in coding, but not recall. However, there is substantial evidence that the memory system is directly involved in not only encoding of information, but also its retrieval and use in making choices. For example, recent work by Michael Shadlin and Daphna Shohani argues that decisions take time because individuals must sample evidence from memory in sequence. We therefore argue that in a more psychologically motivated model of choice behavior in decision times, the dynamics of the response process should be an endogenous outcome of the memory process. And we propose a new model in which this is the case. We can illustrate the distinction between our framework and existing frameworks with the following graphic. In standard models, depicted on the left-hand panel of this figure, an individual is presented with features from the environment, for instance, item in a list. The subject perceives these features and encodes them into memory. For instance, in the temporal context model, this occurs via a process of item and context reinstatement. Then, when asked to recall an item or make a decision, the individual retrieves some set of features from memory, and this set of retrieved features becomes the input into a separate response process that, given some decision rule, eventually converges to a decision. Popular examples of this response process include drift diffusion models and mutual inhibition models, like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. In our model, we assume that the memory process is active not only in perception and coding, but also in a joint retrieval and response process in which features are retrieved from memory and iteratively update over time until these retrieved features converge to some item from the environment. In our paper, we apply this idea of memory iteration to the temporal context model. We assume that the same set of equations characterizing the encoding process also underlies the recall and decision-making processes. The model provides a memory-based explanation for choice behavior and decision times, and thus gives a cognitive interpretation for the parameters in existing models like the drift diffusion model. Finally, to demonstrate the applicability of our model, we show a calibrated model can quantitatively explain multiple well-documented empirical facts about recall order and inner response times and data from a free recall experiment. An attractive property of the model is that its ability to explain these facts relies only on two K parameters. In this presentation, I'm going to first state the core assumptions of the model before I lay out the implications of these assumptions and the quantitative results. So the setting of our model is a standard free recall experiment. Subjects study a list of n items indexed by the letter I. A given subject enters the experiment with some initial context vector C0, which is an m-dimensional unit vector under the L1 norm. Each subject also enters the experiment with an initial matrix of associations M0, which we call memory. The memory matrix stores associations between items in the list and the context in which they were seen. Each of the n items is studied in sequence, and after they are studied, the subject is asked to recall as many items as possible in any order. We model the encoding of the list items into memory by following the standard temporal context model. The equations are adapted from existing work. Cederberg, Hauer, and Kahana 08 is just one example. The main mathematical difference is that we use the L1 norm instead of the L2 norm for tractability. When the subject perceives item I, it evokes an n-dimensional feature representation Fi, which is the ith standard basis vector. The QFI then retrieves an input context Cn from memory by multiplying the memory matrix with the feature vector. Context then updates autoregressively as a weighted average of the previous context, Ci-1, and its new input context. The parameter zeta, which is between 0 and 1, determines how quickly context updates. The larger zeta, the less autocorrelated is context over time. Finally, the associations between the observed features F and latent context C are encoded into memory via an outer product. The temporal context model weights its input by a factor phi to account for primacy effects. This encoding process then repeats for the next word in the list. The core contribution of our model is the joint retrieval and response process. Retrieval occurs using the same set of equations as in encoding with two new assumptions. First and foremost, the subject undergoes a procedure of memory iteration. Using the current context vector and memory matrix, the subject retrieves a set of features which we call Fn. These retrieved features are then interacted with memory to cue a new input context. The new context is then used to retrieve new input features Fn. And this iterative process repeats until the retrieved features converge to a vector that is similar enough to a feature from the environment. Or if the converged features are not close enough to an item from the environment, then nothing is recalled. The second mechanism in our model is competitive retrieval. This mechanism captures the fact that the brain must map internal retrieved feature representations to features of the environment. The idea is similar to that of a hot-filled network, in which a noisy version of a vector can be deblurred by the network. Mathematically, we model this using a power rule, whereby at each memory iteration, larger elements of the retrieved features vector become larger or closer to 1, and smaller elements become smaller or closer to 0. In this expression, f tilde is the feature vector retrieved from memory, and eta, which is larger than 1, is a parameter that implements this competitive retrieval rule. Now I'll discuss the model results. Before studying the full retrieval and response dynamics, it is helpful to study each of our two core mechanisms in isolation. First, we shut down competitive retrieval and study memory iteration. In this case, we can derive the following result. Retrieved features Fn follow a vector autoregression. The change in the feature vector from the time t-1 to time t, which is denoted by delta Fn, equals a linear transformation of the time t-1 retrieved features, where the matrix phi stores associations from memory. We can see that when the rate of context updating zeta is closer to 1, this process will update more quickly. Moreover, we show that this process is stable and convergent. At any given time t, we can express the time t retrieved features as a power of a matrix A times the initial retrieved features, which depends on the context C0 at the time retrieval was initiated. This matrix A has one eigenvalue equal to 1 and all other eigenvalues within the unit circle. Therefore, as t goes to infinity, this vector Fn converges to a finite unit vector. Intuitively, the subject first recalls some features given the initial latent context, then follows the train of thought initiated by that context until those thoughts become clear. Next, we can shut down memory iteration and study competitive retrieval. In this case, retrieved features at any time t are simply a power of the initial retrieved features, which are scaled to remain a unit vector. Mathematically, the subjects retrieve some set of features from memory using their initial context, then identify the most similar standard basis vector. Intuitively, those initial retrieved features are mapped to the most similar feature from the environment, just like the deblurring of a noisy representation by a hot-filled network. When we combine memory iteration and competitive retrieval, we get a rich interaction and dynamics that can vary substantially with the initial condition. In this case, we can show that, up to our first order, the dynamics of retrieved features take the following form. Specifically, the change in retrieved features from time t-1 to time t is the sum of a memory iteration effect, which looks like the autoregression I showed you 2 slides ago, and a competitive retrieval effect, capturing the fact that the power rule increases some elements and decreases others. In both terms, we need to keep track of a Jacobian matrix dF, which contains the derivatives from the competitive retrieval rule. This matrix captures the nonlinearity of the model. The effects interact. What is ultimately recalled depends both on prior associations in memory, the matrix phi, and on whichever features are most prominent at a given time. Like in the 2 separate cases, this system converges to a fixed unit vector, which is a function of the initial context C0. These dynamics yield several insights about choices and response times. First, the model predicts a negative correlation between response time and the strength of an association in memory. However, this correlation is not a rule. Individuals may still reach incorrect decisions quickly or correct decisions slowly, depending on the latent context at the time of initiation. Moreover, this model gives a cognitive interpretation of the parameters used in alternative decision models, such as a drift diffusion or mutual inhibition model. We saw in the equation on the previous slide that a faster context updating rate zeta implies faster convergence and therefore lower average response times. At the same time, the competitive retrieval parameter eta decreases average response times and increases the variance of response times, as memory integration and competitive retrieval may initially drift in different directions. Mutual inhibition among features also arises naturally from both competitive retrieval and competing associations in memory, which ultimately show up in the matrix phi. Finally, I'll walk you through the quantitative results and the model's ability to explain data. In the paper, we calibrate the model parameters, mainly zeta and eta, to show that it's capable of explaining documented facts about recall order and inner response times in a free recall experiment. These effects include recency and primacy in serial position, the distribution of inner response times, temporal contiguity effect in conditional response probabilities and conditional response times, and the fact that inner response times increase on average with successive retrievals. We simulate the model for multiple subjects, studying the recalling a list of length n. The only heterogeneity among these simulated subjects is their pre-experimental context and memory matrices. All other parameters, like zeta and eta, are identical across subjects. Here we plot the probability of first recall. The x-axis shows serial position, and the y-axis is the frequency in which subjects recalled that first word. We see the classic recency and primacy effects, verifying that our retrieval and response process captures these phenomena even after iterating many times. Here we plot the distribution of inner response times in the model and data. We show here the response time for the first recall, but note that the model generates similarly shaped distributions for all output positions. In the right panel, we show data from a recent paper by Goldman and Kahana. In the left panel, the distribution is from our model. You can see that our model matches the right skewed shape of the empirical response time distribution. This plot shows a temporal contiguity effect in lag conditional response probabilities, another classic phenomenon in free recall. The figure plots the conditional probability of recalling an item with a given serial position lag relative to the just recalled item. Our context-based model can explain this fact. Our model explains the analogous phenomena for inner response times. The figure shows the average inner response time at a given lag distance from the just recalled words. In the data, subjects who recall nearby words in the list tend to do so more quickly than subjects who recall distant words. We see this also in our model simulation. Pairing this result with the previous finding, we see evidence of our earlier statement that features with strong association to memory tend to be recalled more quickly. Finally, the model explains the fact that over excessive retrievals, inner response times tend to increase. Each line in this plot corresponds to a different list length. For all list lengths, subjects are on average quickest on their first recall and subsequently take more time, especially towards the end of the retrieval phase. In line with this result, inner response times also increase over successive retrievals when we condition on the number of words a subject successfully recalled. Each line in these plots corresponds to a certain number of recalled items. Both in the data and in the model, inner response times are increasing with output position. This increase is fastest for subjects who recalled few words. So to wrap it up, by accounting for the role of memory in not only encoding but also retrieval and response, we get realistic temporal dynamics of recall and decision making without the need to appeal to separate decision processes. That said, we don't rule out the usefulness of these alternative models. Our context-based model can serve as a foundation for them, which researchers can use to better understand the cognitive processes they represent. Our plan for next steps is to incorporate varying degrees of semantic similarity among list items and study extra list intrusions, and to apply our model beyond free recall, into, for instance, to alternative forced choice experiments and economic decisions outside of the laboratory. I would like to thank the MathPsych program organizers for including our paper and the Computational Memory Lab for supporting this project. I look forward to hearing your feedback and questions. Thank you.